Last night, I had an interesting conversation with my son, Alex, who's 23 years old, but he showed me this reel of the pyramids. And this reel was talking about how the pyramids were built. And it shows scenes of just slaves dragging rocks, dragging all this stone to build these pyramids in ancient Egypt. And then it switches to another scene where there's just cosmic contact, UFOs, and all of this assistance from there. And it's really, which way do you think the pyramids were built, right? And I looked at that, and he feels deep down that there was some sort of extraterrestrial or some sort of help to allow these pyramids to be constructed. Because when we look back from our consciousness, our perspective, we can't see really how that could have been built. Now, people will say, or science will say, well, it could be done physically, it is possible. But when we're looking back, we're using the level of consciousness that we're at now, we're taking ways and means that we could experience today, and we're applying it to the past and saying, okay, well, today this is how we would do it. Therefore, they have the ability to do it back then, right? So we're applying our reasoning from a certain level of consciousness wherever we are now. Now, if you're on the ascension path and you start to open up and you start to connect with higher frequency energy, you start to download or connect with different ways of operating, different ways of doing things. It's like a new instruction book, right? So now we start to look back at the pyramids and we realize, and just as an example, using the pyramids as an example, that maybe there was another way that these were constructed. And we start to open up to a new level of consciousness, a heightened level of consciousness, higher frequency, which then starts to change the story around how maybe these structures were built, right? When we're operating or thinking from a lower level of consciousness, we're using the information that we've learned or the information that we've experienced and applying it to the past and saying, well, that's how it must have been done that way, right? But when we access new levels of consciousness, all of a sudden, new ways of creating, new ways of being start to come forward, and our whole perspective shifts. Now we start to look at these objects and we think, yeah, I don't think there's any way that the ancient Egyptians could have constructed these, and again, talking about the pyramids in this example, without some sort of influence or help. Now, was that influence or help extraterrestrials? Was that influence or help access to higher levels of consciousness, higher dimensional fields where multidimensional energy and beings reside, right? That could have very well have been the norm and likely was the norm back then, where they just had open access and had ways of doing things and means that we can't really comprehend now unless you're one of those on the ascension path and you've started to be able to access these energies and download this information. So my Pleiadian guide, I remember years ago, said to me, we were talking about the planets in Mars and how there's bases on Mars underground, and Mars looks very, very different. This goes for the moon as well. Mars looks very, very different to us from this level of consciousness than reality, right? So we're seeing the solar system and the stars through a dense blanket of fog, essentially. It's a lower frequency blanket of energy that's keeping us cut off. So we look out over into space and across the planets and things, and we see a very cold, very 3D reality. That's because of the lens that we're looking through. Think we're looking through a low-powered telescope lens, right? We can't see all the vibrant detail. We can't see all the high frequency energy. The information that we're receiving is being filtered through a dense blanket, everything within that Van Allen belt, right? Low frequency um, blanket of energy that's essentially keeping us quarantined. So when you can go beyond that and rise in frequency, you start to be able to peer through that blanket and things start to look very different. She was explaining to me that Mars is like, it's an alive, very vibrant place. And many of the planets in the solar system, in fact, there's life everywhere. We just can't see it because we're behind this thick veil. So when it comes to the Earth and comes to these structures, these pyramids, and Stonehenge and all of these things all over the world that popped up from different civilizations that supposedly had no interaction or no contact. In fact, a lot of these structures appeared over different times in history. One has to think, if we apply what we know now scientifically, that really doesn't fit, doesn't really make sense, right? With the means that they would have had to have to create these structures. How can you create these huge pyramid structures that are really sound resonant chambers that moves electricity across the meridian lines of the Earth that are aligned with objects in the sky, Orion's belt, whatever those may be, going around the planet, the Pleiades, right? How is all this information accessible to those humans who were building it back then? Unless they had some sort of outside help or and higher consciousness available to be able to come up with the means to be able to build these structures in ways where they could use stones that weighed thousands of pounds and be able to cut those stones, move those stones in a way that the finished product ended up with hollow resonance chambers and things like that within the structure. All would have had to been planned ahead and engineered to be able to build that structure if you were thinking about the process from this level of consciousness. Okay, do you understand? So when we can let go of that and we start to step into higher frequency energy, all of that kind of goes out the window. And there are things that maybe we don't quite yet understand and ways and means that were used to build these structures or create these structures using ways that we have not tapped into because we've descended as a species, dropped in frequency. Essentially, that blanket of fog got thicker and we cut ourselves off from the information that they had back then. So now, those of us who are awake and ascending into this energy consciously, we start to download this information and this knowing, and we start to communicate with multidimensional beings or star guides, right? And we start to get nuggets of information that changes the way we think. We expand. We now have a new way of thinking. And then we can look back in the past and say, ah, now I'm starting to understand how they were able to create these things because there's a higher level of consciousness at play here, things that science and humanity, lower frequency humanity, doesn't have the capacity to understand. So right now there's a version of Earth, right? Many versions of Earth, where the pyramids are fully operational and fully functional. We're seeing a lower frequency version of the planet because that's where our collective consciousness is focused. So as we continue to rise in frequency, all of those ancient artifacts are going to start to change. They're going to start to light up. Energy is going to start to flow differently. We're going to start to tap into that reality. As we rise in frequency, we will be rising into timelines where those buildings, all of those structures, their function becomes apparent to us because we have risen into the bandwidth of frequency where all of that information is accessible to us. So when you're looking around at these things, when you're looking out into the sky, saying, where is everybody? Remember that we're looking through a low frequency lens, right? We're seeing vast distances that really don't exist. We just think they do. So therefore, we try to rationalize or understand how could a species navigate those great distances because we're thinking from a level of consciousness that is only comprehending space and time distance because that's what we're experiencing in this reality. When we start to think dimensionally and vertically based on frequency, there's no longer time, there's no longer space, there's no longer distance. It's simply just dropping in and out of different frequencies. So when we continue to do the healing work, we continue to rise in frequency. We continue to be able to connect to these higher frequency bandwidths, 4D, 5D, 6D, 7D, and up. We start to become aware of those energies. And within those bandwidths, reality appears a little bit different, right? A little bit different. And it's subtle. And as you're rising, you may not notice it unless you're keenly aware of the differences. We start getting synchronicities. We start to realize the animals are approaching us. There's a lot less fear, things like that. That's moving up into a new version of Earth. And as we continue to ascend, the energy of the pyramids and all these great, amazing structures, it's going to become more available to you, right? It was always there. You just weren't aware of it because you were focused in on a lower state of being, a lower state of consciousness based on your programming, what you've been taught, religion, whatever that is, was keeping you rationalizing your reality or experiencing your reality from a lower bandwidth of consciousness. When you start to let go of all of those hardened, fast rules, right? Physics and things like that, which is a way, even mathematics, it's a way for the human brain to make sense of the reality. When you start to loosen your grip on these hard and fast rules, new ideas start to drop in, new ideas start to come forward that were not consistent or didn't fit into the little box of where the consciousness of humanity was, right? So we're expanding that box. In fact, eventually we're going to obliterate that box, right? So all the rules that we thought we had to live by for this reality are going to start to become a little more pliable. Just like as we move up into 4D, time and space starts to become a little more pliable. It's a lot less fixed, right? We could experience the passage of time and even traverse distances in different ways that don't fit into the traditional 3D model. You don't have to physically jump on a plane and go somewhere. You could actually experience that location through the quantum field. That's an expansion of consciousness. So we need to release the 3D ways that we thought the world worked so that we could allow something new to come forward in an expansive way. And when you start to look around at your reality from that lens, you start to see through the blanket of density, the fog. You start to see the craft that are up there signaling you, right? All of a sudden they're there. They start to appear, right? Because you're changing the way you think about things. You're not as rigid, you're more open. You start to look at these amazing structures around the planet and you start to have visions of maybe how they were constructed or who was involved in that and how that was done, the knowledge behind it. Those types of things all starts to come forward, a new way of being. And that is just you starting to open up to a higher frequency, new version of Earth. You're starting to peer into it because you are allowing yourself to expand up into higher frequency dimensional fields where those realities exist. So when you're looking around in reality, let's have a little less rigid view of it and a more open view. And let's start to entertain some of these concepts that maybe science could call radical, right? Let's try to open up. Let's start to lean into those and open up into those and start to realize that, yeah, there are things that exist that the human brain or that level of consciousness can't quite grasp, but yet sometime in the past, it was there and it's returning. It's becoming accessible to you again. You just have to be able to release yourself from the limitations of your own mind. This video resonated with you. Watch this one next. I'd be so grateful. Thank you.